A lecturer from Lancaster University specialising in Gothic literature and culture, I should say.
Hi.
Well, you were previously, you used to dress in a more Gothic style.
I did when I was a teenager and in my early 20s. I certainly really embraced that look, I think.
Yeah, and it carries on today, as we've seen from that report.
It does.
Is it a growing trend? I mean, we tend to think of it as being quite a specialist and a minority kind of area, but what's the evidence?
I think it is, and I think one of the ways in which it is really growing is through this expansion into other geographical territories rather than the UK and America, which are traditionally its strongholds. So now you get goths in Japan, you get goths in South America, you get goths in Eastern Europe, in Scandinavia, and those are perhaps some of the areas where it's growing the most as a movement or as a subculture, and because of the way that the internet has allowed access into the inspirations and the materials for the subculture.
Is it more acceptable to be a goth these days?
I think in some ways it is and in some ways it isn't, and it probably depends exactly where you are. So if you're a goth in Russia, it probably isn't more acceptable. In fact, it might be quite controversial to be a goth, but probably if you're a goth in a big UK city, it is more acceptable.
We were just looking at some of the, we were seeing some of the images of people dressed up. Now, some of them people sort of recognise. I mean, some people look almost quite punk. There was a guy wearing a gas mask a moment ago, which is not something I would naturally link with being a goth. But I mean, is there a blending of a lot of other things going on?
There is, and I think that's one of the reasons why goth has had this longevity, because it naturally kind of cannibalizes all these other styles and subcultural looks. So you do get bits of punk, you get bits of fetish style, you get other kind of retro and vintage looks, Victoriana particularly, that are incorporated into goth style and kind of brought within the overall goth look.
It's become popular, as you mentioned, the internet as well, but fashion has really embraced goth styles.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've got some clips of them, or some pictures of Lady Gaga, who obviously reinvents herself in all sorts of ways. But when I look at something like this, I imagine goth to be very dark, black, lots of black. This is all white. I mean, this is more what you'd imagine. It can be anything, can't it?
Well, perhaps not anything, but it certainly takes a very diverse range of influences. And the white look, I remember back in the 80s and early 90s, there was a real trend for girls to wear white riding dresses to festivals, and that was a really goth look. And there's something about white and its connections with ghostliness and spectrality that make that a very gothic look, I think. But what you say about fashion is certainly true. Really, from the mid-1990s onwards, you have designers like Alexander McQueen, in particular John Galliano, picking up on goth style and indeed on gothic literary and cinematic influences and kind of incorporating those into their vision, and then those looks trickling down to the high street.
You asked a question earlier before we started. If you ever stop being goth, is it a trend that you can pick up on, or is it part of your identity that never goes away and shouldn't go away?
I think for a really large proportion of goths, it's something that never goes away, that they may modify it as they grow older and evolve their lifestyle. But once a goth, always a goth, I think. But then, of course, there are people that it's also a phase, and they may want to do it for a year or two, or maybe even just for a weekend, for a particular fancy dress party or whatever. So,
do you think, I'm trying to think, obviously we saw people dressed up there in the way they wouldn't be, I don't know, if they go to work. But do you think that people have a feeling about the way people dress? Does it carry with it something in a way people are a bit suspicious of?
it does, and to a certain extent that's deliberate. You don't dress in that way if you don't want to provoke some kind of reaction.
Making some statement.
Yes, but I think, again, it very much depends on context. I think in big urban locations, Manchester or London, it's part of the overall heady mix of different styles, but perhaps if you're in a small provincial town, it can cause more suspicion. I'm thinking particularly of something like the terrible murder of Sophie Lancaster in 2007, where she and her boyfriend were assaulted basically for the way that they looked, and Sophie in fact died as a result of those injuries.
Very interesting talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up in the next half hour.